Hello guys, back again with me, Mimin. As usual, today Mimin will discuss a unique movie. This time, Mimin will talk about a French film titled The Shower from 2017. This movie tells the story of the lives of women in a remote village who suddenly lose all the men after they are arrested due to political rebellion. The women must find ways to survive without men, until one day, a stranger arrives and ignites their spirits to maintain their population. So guys, how does the story unfold? Let's dive into the plot. The movie is set in a remote mountain village in France in 1851. It starts with scenes of unrest in the villages, where most of the men, who were supporters of the Republic, are arrested by the soldiers of Louis Napoleon, who had established an authoritarian regime. This chaos is the result of Louis Napoleon's coup d'état, in which he, after his term as president had ended, suddenly staged a coup to extend his power, transforming the French Republic with its term limits into the French Empire, an authoritarian regime. Since then, all adult men suspected of opposing the regime were forcibly taken away. The women and children could only plead for their release, but the soldiers remained silent, offering no explanation. Moments later, they hear a man's voice, mocking Louis Napoleon and calling for democracy. But before long, the sound of gunfire rings out. The soldiers had shot the man, leaving his lifeless body behind without a second thought. The women approach the body, which turns out to be the husband of one of the women named Rose. She falls to her knees, cradling his body as she sobs uncontrollably. That night, after the tragic event, all the women and children in the village gather together in one place. They come to a solemn agreement: if they are to survive, they must rely on each other and continue living together without the men. The women discuss the fate of the men, wondering if they would ever return or if they had been lost forever. Then they began to speculate, imagining that the men would likely be punished forever for being considered rebels. A young girl named Violet approached the women who were overseeing the food distribution and asked about the whereabouts of her friend, Rose, who had seemingly been staying in her room all day. Violet decided to bring some food for her. Upon arriving at Rose's room, she found her still deeply saddened after losing her husband, sitting in silence, seemingly lost in grief. Seeing this, Violet gently tried to comfort her, hugging her in an attempt to help Rose recover from her sorrow. The next day, Violet visited the village elder because she had been feeling uneasy about strange visions she had been experiencing lately. Violet had been hallucinating about a predator-like figure, which made her curious about its meaning. The elder asked her if she had ever been unfaithful to her fiancé, to which Violet honestly replied that she hadn't. Violet admitted that ever since the men, including her fiancé, had left, she had lost hope in life. She had become numb, indifferent to everything, as if she had lost all sense of feeling. Upon hearing this, the elder couldn't interpret what it meant, and instead advised Violet to search for the meaning on her own. That afternoon, the women were working in the fields, taking over the tasks usually handled by the men. They had also been equipped with rifles for protection. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire echoed, breaking the serene atmosphere and filling it with tension. The women assured one another that the noise posed no danger and calmly resumed their work. However, Rose, still traumatized, became panicked and anxious at the sound of the shots. Later, in the meadow, Mrs. Russ approached Violet and her friends while they were busy milking sheep. She mentioned that Rose had suddenly disappeared, and today, in fact, was supposed to be her wedding anniversary. Concerned, Violet immediately ran off to search for Rose but found no sign of her. She continued searching, but Rose was nowhere to be found. In the end, she found Russ in the meadow, where Russ was seen burning her wedding gown while sobbing uncontrollably. Violet immediately sat by her side to comfort her. The next morning, while washing clothes, Russ's mother told her friends that her daughter had finally slept and seemed to be feeling a little better. An older woman named Marine, with a cold demeanor, reassured Russ's mother that her daughter would surely forget her grief within 3 days, so they shouldn't worry. At this point, Violet immediately protested, saying that they would never feel at peace until they knew what had happened to the men out there. Another woman replied that the men had probably already been judged and that they shouldn't expect their return. However, Violet remained resolute in her desire to find out more, suggesting that the women should leave the mountains and search for information. Many of the younger women agreed with Violet, but Marine stopped them, arguing that going to the town would only invite the soldiers to come here, which would be dangerous for all the women. She didn't want the women to be captured and turned into slaves by the soldiers. Marian's response angered some of the women, but they still had to respect the decisions made by their elders. Driven by curiosity, Violet decided to leave the village alone to search for answers. She ventured through the forests, but along the way, Violet stopped abruptly when she saw a group of soldiers stationed at a bridge. Forced to turn back, she detoured and stopped by Mrs. Ao's house to see if she could learn anything there. Believing Mrs. Ao to be out, Violet walked a few steps further. However, to her horror, she discovered Mrs. Ao's lifeless body hanging, suggesting that she had taken her own life. Violet immediately rushed back to the village and broke the terrible news to the women, leaving the entire community in shock and grief. A few days later, the women gathered to observe their wheat fields, and they all agreed that the time for harvest had arrived. The vast expanse of the fields made them doubt whether they could complete the task on time. On the other hand, Violet awoke from her sleep and realized that she was experiencing menstruation. Soon, all the women and children were summoned to work together to harvest the wheat. The weather was scorching hot, and since they weren't used to this type of work, Violet's hands became injured. They eventually had to stop due to exhaustion. Although many complained, they knew they had no choice but to endure the difficult circumstances. There were still many tasks typically done by men that now fell on them to finish. To relieve their fatigue, the women decided to take the children to bathe in the river. This way, they could cool off while letting the children have some fun. While the children played in the water, the young women gathered and started to express their worries about the future. For the mothers who already had children, there was still some hope of continuing their lives. However, for those who had yet to marry, their prospects seemed bleak, especially if the men never returned. One night, a woman suffering from depression had an outburst and started ringing the village bell. She was crying in despair, devastated by her husband's absence. The loud ringing woke up all the women, prompting them to gather at the source of the noise. They hurriedly stopped the woman and tried to calm her down. The following morning, the young women gathered in the rice fields. They confessed that they hadn't been able to sleep, overcome with fear that they might truly be alone in this isolated village. One of the women suggested that Violet should lead the younger women away from the village to build a new life elsewhere. However, Violet refused, as did Russ, who was also unwilling to leave her husband's grave behind. They also imagined what would happen if all the men on the planet died, considering that no shepherd men ever passed through their village, as if time had stopped. That thought made them smile, and then one of the women said that if they found one man, he would be the last man on earth. Therefore, they would have to share him equally so that they could have children together. Josephine opposed this wild imagination, saying it violated their concept of monogamy, but it seemed that the women ignored her and instead agreed with the idea of sharing the man. A moment later, an elderly woman suddenly arrived and immediately ordered them to harvest the wheat in the barn. The mothers began to worry slightly about the wild conversations of the younger women. If the men never returned, they might consider fleeing from the village. The scene then shifted to show Violet while she slept. In her sleep, she was seen touching her sensitive area, indicating that she deeply longed for a partner. While working with her younger brother, Violet shared a little about their father, whom she considered an educated man. Their father often met with the Democratic Republic Party to engage in discussions. He used to teach Violet how to read and write from a young age. As a result, Violet was the only woman in the village who knew how to read. Here, Violet promised she would teach him how to read because she believed it was very important. After that, Violet and Rose sat together to knit. Rose opened up again, saying how much she hoped another man would come to her. It would help her forget Mendy, her lover, and free her from her sorrow. Rose wanted to relive the night of her first time with her late husband, which she remembered as beautiful. Hearing this, Violet became curious and asked what it felt like. Rose replied that the feeling was indescribable. A sudden heavy rain came, and Violet quickly realized that the barn where they stored their wheat was leaking. She immediately ran and called all the women to help fix the roof. In the midst of the downpour, they worked together to repair it, even though it was very risky for their safety since none of them had any experience in handling such a situation. After working cautiously, they managed to fix it, and fortunately, only a small portion of the wheat was damaged. The women were grateful to Violet for alerting them in time. Spring arrived, and Violet began teaching the children how to read the alphabet. The children appeared joyful and very enthusiastic about learning. Meanwhile, the women continued harvesting the apple orchard, working calmly according to their knowledge. One day, an unfamiliar man suddenly greeted them and approached. All the women stared at him silently, as it seemed clear that he was not one of them. Since he didn't receive any response, the man moved closer to Violet and introduced himself as Jin, a blacksmith. Jin was a traveling worker, and now he was in need of lodging. Violet was initially hesitant to give him an answer because she felt awkward in front of the other women. However, after the elder subtly encouraged her, Violet finally replied and offered him one of the vacant houses as lodging. Violet then led Jin to the house on foot. Along the way, Jin noticed the strange looks the women were giving him. Upon arriving in the village, he asked Violet where all the men were. Violet responded that she would show him tomorrow. Jin shared that he came from a farm in the valley, where he worked as a day laborer and usually stayed in barns or warehouses. Therefore, Jin was a bit surprised when Violet told him she would be offering him a house to stay in. As soon as they entered his new home, Violet went to prepare his bed. She brought him some fruit and water, which made the man want to do something in return. Jin asked her if they had a horse or donkey whose shoes needed repairing. Violet responded that they did, so Jin instructed her to call the horseman to bring the animal to him. Violet fell silent and then told him that there were no men in the village, all had been captured after the coup. Jin then spoke about the state of affairs in the valley. He mentioned that Louis Napoleon had been crowned emperor a few months ago, meaning that the French Republic had now turned into an empire. It was reported that many prisoners accused of being Republicans had either died or been deported at the very least. This news saddened Violet, and she left soon after hearing it. Before leaving, she mentioned to Jin that the villagers were in need of manpower. Jin replied that he was willing to help them. Violet hurried to meet the other women, where she found them already gathered, waiting. One of the women asked if the man knew anything about the condition of the prisoners. Violet withheld the information, not wanting to sadden them. She simply said that she hadn't dared to ask, as they needed to make sure first whether the man supported Louis Napoleon or not. From a distance, Violet's mother could be seen looking displeased at seeing her daughter close to a stranger. She quickly instructed the women to return to their work. Meanwhile, the elder informed Violet that she would now be responsible for watching over the stranger. Later that evening, Marion helped Violet prepare dinner for Jin. As they were setting the table, Violet's younger brother ran inside. He excitedly told them that Jin had spoken to his friend, saying that he hadn't found another village besides this one in the mountains. Hearing that, Violet believed that Jin would not leave. She carried the food to Jin's room, where everything seemed eerily quiet. Panicking at the thought that Jin might have left, she climbed the stairs to check his room. Violet felt relieved when she found Jin sleeping soundly, but her curiosity grew when she noticed a pistol inside Jin's bag. Later that night, as Jin was tidying up his room, he became puzzled by the sight of women peeking at him through the windows of their houses. Violet, who was also peeking, felt embarrassed when she realized that all the other women were just as curious about Jin. Realizing this, the women quickly closed their windows. The next morning, the women gathered to begin harvesting. Jin joined them and started by cutting the wheat first. Nervously, the women followed behind him. Jin found it odd how they acted and soon realized that the villagers still adhered to traditional concepts, where men were highly respected. As everyone gathered for a break, eating together, Jin complimented the women, admiring how they managed everything on their own. He acknowledged how brave and difficult that must have been. The women accepted his genuine praise, except for Marion, who loudly retorted that they didn't need such praise. They were used to hard work without compliments, even before the men were taken captive. Her response shocked everyone, creating an awkward silence. Despite this, Jin understood their feelings, and instead of responding, he chose to continue harvesting the wheat. Because of her mother's words, Violet left the group and went to sit by herself under a tree. Rose came to her and asked what had happened to their mother, why she seemed so easily angered. Violet simply advised Rose not to pay attention to it, explaining that their mother was still hoping for her husband's return and refused to betray his memory. Rose then shifted the conversation back to Jin, mentioning how Violet seemed to get along with him. However, Violet seemed to reject the praise and view Jin as just an ordinary man. The women continued their daily activities, and Jin eagerly helped them. This enthusiasm led one of the women to scold Marion, saying that the man didn't deserve such harsh words. Though Marion wasn't fond of Jin, the women were determined to keep him in the village. The next day, as Violet brought food, she saw Jin reading, which made her even more intrigued by him. Curious, she asked deeper questions. Jin, who had already sensed Violet's concerns, reassured her, explaining that he didn't care about the political coup. He was simply a blacksmith with no home, living a nomadic life. To prove his words, he showed her a certificate, verifying that he was indeed just a blacksmith. Violet read the certificate, and Jin was surprised to find that someone in this village could read. Violet explained that she was the only one who could read, thanks to her educated father. Jin was moved by the joy Violet displayed as she read the words on the paper, and he handed her his book. Violet was overjoyed, admitting that it was her first time holding a book. As Violet began to read, Jin suddenly moved closer to her, which made her nervous, so she stepped away. Before she left, Jin complimented Violet's father for his dedication to defending the Democratic Republic, making Violet feel more confident that Jin wasn't a threat to her. Back at home, Violet spent her time engrossed in the book. From a distance, her mother, Maria, watched with concern, constantly observing the changes in her daughter's behavior. The next morning, they returned to harvesting. Jin became puzzled by the way the women acted around him, always turning their backs to him as if they were teasing or flirting, but Jin didn't pay much attention to it. He continued fetching water, taking turns, while the others intentionally left Violet alone with Jin. As they carried water together, they began talking about the books they had read. Violet admitted that her father had a collection of French literature, but the papers were very precious and she needed her father's permission to access them. Jin suggested she share what the books were about, and Violet responded that she would tell him later. Later, Rose had a private conversation with Violet, urging her to seduce Jin quickly, warning that if she waited too long, Jin might leave the village. The women were already beginning to think that Violet might not be able to carry out the task, and some of them were considering stepping in to take Jin for themselves. This left Violet silent and anxious. The next morning, Violet noticed Jin starting to talk to some of the women. He was now the center of attention. Violet brought food to Jin again, and this time, she started telling him about the books she had read. Jin was intrigued, and they sat facing each other as Violet recited a poem. Jin was captivated, so much so that he began to touch Violet. Although tense, Violet continued reading her poem. But eventually, she gave in to Jin's advances, and the two of them took things further in his room. Afterward, Violet returned home, filled with fear, as it was her first time experiencing something like that. She decided to hide her relationship with Jin from her mother. The next day, as they continued harvesting, Rose smiled at Violet as if she understood that Violet had successfully seduced Jin. Later, Violet brought food to Jin once more, and this time, Jin unexpectedly approached her and touched her again. Outside, the women were chatting, and then Violet and Jin stepped out of the house together, making some of the other women envious. However, Rose defended Violet, saying that Violet had successfully seduced Jin, and thanks to her, Jin would stay longer in the village. That night, Jin read a poem to Violet. The poem spoke of the endless desires of the human heart: love, strength, home, food, and prosperity. How beautiful it would be if everyone could live simply, eating and drinking from the land, and in turn, love their land. The next morning, while washing clothes, Violet noticed sharp glares from her friends, as if they were hostile towards her. The other girls were jealous of her happiness, thinking it was unfair that she could get the man every woman dreamed of, simply because Jin had chosen to walk toward her. One woman reminded Violet of their earlier agreement: if a man appeared, they would share him equally. Angry upon hearing this, Violet responded by telling them they were free to try and seduce him themselves. Another woman shot back, saying they would do so, and they wouldn't need Violet's permission because, to them, Violet was nobody. This harsh response made Violet furious, and she stormed off, upset, continuing her tasks alone. When she arrived at the field, Jin approached her. He comforted Violet, telling her that he would always remain loyal to her. At that moment, Violet revealed her responsibility to share Jin with the other women in the village, as it had been part of their agreement from the beginning. No other men had returned, and all the women needed Jin to continue the bloodline. Upon hearing this, Jin was immediately repulsed. He told Violet that they were all insane. He couldn't believe that Violet and the rest of the villagers only saw him as a tool for reproduction and survival. For Jin, this was not a way for any human being to think, and it was utterly dishonorable. Jin turned and asked, "What if the men come back?" Violet tried to justify her words, but no matter what reason she gave, Jin already felt degraded. He walked away. In the evening, Violet asked her mother about Jin's whereabouts, but her mother said she didn't know. Violet rushed to Jin's lodging and found the house empty. Rose and two other women approached Violet on the stairs, asking why Jin hadn't returned. Violet explained that she had told Jin the truth, and that's what caused him to flee. Rose was confident that Jin would come back and told Violet to remain calm. Later that night, Violet was waiting for Jin in her bed. Suddenly, she stood up, convinced that Jin wasn't just an ordinary blacksmith. Violet began searching through Jin's wardrobe and found some papers. Upon reading them, she was shocked to discover that they were amnesty papers granted to Jin, forgiving him for being a fugitive after Louis Napoleon's coup. Violet now realized that Jin was no ordinary man. The next day, Violet and the other women continued to wait for Jin. Not long after, Jin came back, behaving as usual, which made Violet feel a bit more at ease. That evening, she brought him food again. This time, Jin said that he had accepted Violet's decision and was willing to share himself with all the women. Violet remained silent, then asked if Jin was agreeing to this only because he was still a fugitive and needed a place to hide. This remark caught Jin off guard, making him realize that Violet had likely read his amnesty letter. Jin went back to his room to check his belongings, contemplating whether he should leave. However, he still had feelings for Violet, and the dangerous conditions outside made staying seem like the safer choice. Meanwhile, Violet met Rose at the church and told her about Jin's decision to fulfill the women's request. Rose thanked her. Even though Violet felt that whatever they were doing to Jin was wrong, the next day, they all resumed their activities. The women seemed to be flirting with Jin even more. Violet, unable to bear watching, decided to bathe in the river. Unbeknownst to her, Jin followed her. He approached and immediately embraced her, trying to reassure her that he would never leave her. The next day, Jin helped Violet and her friend harvest the wheat. Violet noticed that her friend was flirting with Jin, so she decided to leave them alone. When the situation quieted down, one of the women touched Jin and forced him into an intimate moment. Reluctantly, Jin accepted. While hanging clothes to dry, Violet saw Jin having a romantic moment with her friend, which made her a bit uneasy. She immediately went to Jin to tell him that his meal was ready. Jin honestly told her that he had been intimate with another woman, as per their agreement, and that he would be with yet another woman that night. Violet agreed, though she clearly felt very uncomfortable. That night, as Violet slept, she dreamt of an owl preying on a mouse. She woke up suddenly, realizing the meaning of the visions she'd been experiencing all along. Violet rushed to Jin's room that night after he had been with another woman. They embraced, and Violet confessed that she loved him deeply and was afraid of losing him. The next day, while working in the fields, Violet saw her younger brother playing with one of the women. At first, it seemed innocent, but over time, she realized that her brother was being treated inappropriately by the woman. Violet immediately pushed the woman away and took her brother with her. Later that evening, Violet met with Rose. She seemed to be saying her goodbyes at her husband's grave. Russ mentioned that she would be with Jin the next day and that she was ready to have a child. She didn't mean to hurt Violet's feelings, but she was only following through on their initial agreement. The next day, Violet brought food for Jin, and she asked him not to hide his background anymore. Jin opened up, sharing that he had once shot a man in self-defense, and if the government caught him, he would be sentenced to hang. As a fugitive, Jin had been walking along the ridges to reach the border and escape France. However, along the way, he found the village and met Violet. Jin confessed that if it weren't for Violet, he would have left long ago. Hearing this, Violet smiled. Days passed, and one day, the village elder informed Violet that she was pregnant. Overjoyed by the news, Violet couldn't wait to tell Jin. Since becoming pregnant, Violet became even more enthusiastic about teaching her younger siblings, and her bond with Jin grew stronger after he found out she was expecting. Despite this, Jin continued to divide his time equally among the women in the village. They would often walk together, and Jin would take turns conversing with them. It was also evident that several other women's bellies were growing, indicating that they, too, were pregnant. One day, something surprising happened. Two men suddenly appeared in the village square, looking anxious. All the women gathered around them, and it was revealed that one of the men was a relative of one of the villagers. His name was Yuden, and he had been traveling with a stranger. Yuden explained that several men had been deported to Algeria. Meanwhile, the fate of the others remained unknown. It was highly likely that most of them had died due to the violence they had endured. However, Yuden and a few others were freed, and two of the men were on their way home. One of them was Russ' father. This news made some of the women happy, as their families had survived, but it wasn't the same for everyone else. Marion fainted when she heard that her husband hadn't survived, and Violet realized that her father would never return. On the other hand, Jin grew uneasy after seeing Yuden's unpleasant expression. This made him reconsider whether he should stay or leave for his own safety. Russ and Violet went to meet with the elder, wondering how they would explain the babies they were carrying to the men who had returned, including their fathers. They would surely be angry if the women were completely honest. The elder suggested that the women hide anything Jin had done in order to protect their babies, and that Jin himself should leave as soon as possible to avoid complicating the situation. Violet disagreed with the elder's words. She decided that she would follow Jin if he left because she truly loved him. On the other hand, Jin remained silent, realizing that he would become the root of the problem if he stayed. That night, Violet began packing her things, intending to run away with Jin. However, when she went to Jin's lodging, the house was empty, and all she found was a letter. It turned out that Jin had already left. In the letter, Jin expressed that although he loved Violet, he felt that the best course of action was for him to leave. He believed that the situation they were facing was too complicated, and he didn't want to remain part of the uncertainty and pressure in the village. He didn't want to make things worse by staying, and he hoped that Violet and the other women in the village could find peace again, just as they had before. The letter revealed that Jin was aware of Violet's feelings, but he chose to leave for the sake of their well-being. In the end, they both parted ways, with no knowledge of when or if they would ever meet again. At the end of the film, it is shown that Violet's baby was born safely, along with a joyful expression on Violet's face. This meant that life in the village was now peaceful again, as long as they could keep secret everything that had been done by Jin. And with that, the film came to a close.